Mark Rutte, the NATO chief, who is your friend, he called you daddy earlier. Do you regard your NATO allies as kind of children?
No, he likes me. I think he likes me. If he doesn't, I'll let you know. I'll come back and I'll hit him hard, okay? No? He did it very affectionate. Daddy, you're my daddy.
And then daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
You have to use strong language. Every once in a while, you have to use a certain word. They're going to be purchasing hundreds of billions of dollars worth of military equipment. Well, remember, I'm the one that ended Nord Stream 2. Going to a place called Germany, come to think of it. I'm sorry I did that. But I ended Nord Stream 2. Nobody else did.
There will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
It has become increasingly obvious to people all around the world that the United States does not really have allies. It has countries that it uses to advance its own political and economic interests. And the presidency of Donald Trump has made this very clear. Trump is extremely transactional, and when it comes to foreign relations, he's only interested in what other countries can do for the United States. However, it should be clear that this kind of aggressive imperialist approach did not start with Donald Trump. As is so often the case, this is a decades-long problem, and other past US presidents carried out very similar policies, but Trump has removed all nuance and made it as clear as day. And this is especially evident in Trump's economic war that he's been waging on countries all around the world, and the tariffs that he's been imposing not only on Washington's geopolitical adversaries, but also on longtime so-called US allies. And the best example of this is how Trump has treated Europe. This July, Trump imposed an unequal treaty on Europe, an extremely unequal agreement in which the US benefits and the EU gets nothing. As the Financial Times put it, the EU succumbed to Trump's tariff steamroller. The key part of this very one-sided agreement that Trump has imposed on Europe is that the EU will allow the US to impose 15% tariffs on all EU exports to the US, and the EU will have no tariffs on US goods. So US companies will be protected from European competition, but European companies will not be protected from US competition. This is why British state media, the BBC, said very clearly that US industries are winning from this deal and European industries are losing. In particular, European car industries, like the massive German car industry with major German automakers like Volkswagen and BMW and Mercedes-Benz, they're going to lose out because any European car exported to the US will be more expensive, 15% more expensive, whereas US car companies will be able to export their autos to Europe with no tariff. So they're going to be more competitive at a lower price point in Europe. And the same thing is true for the US pharmaceutical industry. US drugs will be cheaper in Europe, whereas European drugs will be more expensive in the US. Although I should point out that Trump has constantly claimed falsely that Europe will pay for these tariffs. That's not true. Other countries don't pay for tariffs. It is importers in the US that pay for tariffs. So for instance, car dealers in the US who sell German cars like BMWs or Volkswagens, those car dealers will have to pay a 15% tariff on the imports into the US, not the German automakers. They're not actually paying the tariff, but they will be hurt because it will be more difficult for them to compete in the US market. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it is the US consumer that is going to have to pay higher prices for European products, which is why the BBC also said correctly that US consumers lose from this deal. Trump wins, US corporations and, big billionaires who funded Trump's campaign, they all win because they face less competition internationally, more domestic protection, and US consumers and European companies lose from this one-sided deal. This is why a European diplomat told the Financial Times that Trump is, quote, the bully in the schoolyard, and we didn't join others in standing up to him. Those who don't hang together get hanged separately, end quote. Another European official pointed out that the EU would be in a much better position economically if it had actually retaliated when Trump first announced these tariffs on Europe in April. This is what China did. China defended itself when Trump imposed these unilateral aggressive tariffs. They were not reciprocal, as Trump falsely claimed. They were unilateral. And China responded proportionately with actual reciprocal tariffs, saying to the US, every time you hit our companies with tariffs, we will hit your companies with tariffs. And Trump was forced to back down. What did Europe do? Europe completely capitulated. It gave in and surrendered and said, yes, sir, Emperor Trump, we will do whatever you want. And this is how we ended up in the situation where not only is Europe accepting this very one-sided deal in which the US will hit European companies with tariffs, but not vice versa, but it's not just that. It even gets worse. The pro-US Atlanticist leader of the EU, the Commissioner Ursula von der Leyen, announced proudly that Europe will purchase $750 billion worth of US energy. As von der Leyen put it, quote, we will replace Russian gas and oil with significant purchases of US liquefied natural gas, LNG, oil, and nuclear fuels, end quote. So she's boasting of how the US benefits from this deal and Europe has to pay for more expensive energy instead of getting cheap pipeline gas from Russia, which is significantly less expensive than US LNG, which has to be sent across the Atlantic Ocean. And furthermore, Trump also claimed that as part of this deal, Europe will have to invest $600 billion in the US economy to benefit the US at the expense of Europe. Here's a clip from the press conference in which Trump boasts about the details of the agreement.
They're going to be purchasing hundreds of billions of dollars worth of military equipment. They're very important. They're going to purchase $750 billion worth of energy. So that's going to be great. And $600 billion worth of investments into the United States over and above what they have.
So these deals that Donald Trump has imposed on Europe at the expense of the European people to benefit US corporations are perfect symbols of how the US exploits its so-called allies. These are unequal treaties. And Trump was so happy when he announced this agreement that he imposed on the EU. He called it the biggest deal ever.
It's a very powerful deal. It's a very big deal. It's the biggest of all the deals. It will be the biggest of all the deals. So we're very honored to have done so.
And one of the most revealing moments in the press conference announcing this deal was a journalist asked Ursula von der Leyen, the EU commissioner, what does the EU get from this deal? Does the US make any concessions? And of course, von der Leyen did not really answer the question, but the answer is no. The US is not making any concessions. In fact, this vassal, this puppet of the US, von der Leyen, talked about how actually the EU previously had a trade surplus with the US. So we need to bend over backward to benefit the US at our expense. These are the so-called leaders in charge of Europe who are serving their region to the US empire on a silver platter.
I have a question for the EU Commission President. What are the US concessions? What is the US giving up in the deal, if anything?
So the starting point was an imbalance, a surplus on our side and a deficit on the US side. And we wanted to rebalance the trade relation. And we wanted to do it in a way that trade goes on between the two of us across the Atlantic, because the two biggest economies should have a good trade flow between us. And I think we hit exactly the point we wanted to find. Rebalance, but enable trade on both sides, which means good jobs on both sides of the Atlantic, means prosperity on both sides of the Atlantic, And that was important for us.
And again, the energy is a very important component because we have more energy than anybody else in that sense. And I think it was very wise that they buy a lot of energy, and it's great stuff, and it solves a lot of problems. So that was a great decision, I think.
So to summarize, a journalist asked the EU leader, "What is the US giving up?" And she said nothing. The US gets everything, and Europe gives up everything. And Trump boasted about how Europe is going to be buying all of this oil and gas from US companies, and they're not going to be buying it from Russia. So, of course, the US empire is happy, and some warhawks in Europe are happy that European trade with Russia will continue to decline and dry up. It's already very little after the war in Ukraine. But instead of buying energy from Russia, Europe will now be completely dependent as vassals on energy exports from the US. And as I said earlier, this did not start with Donald Trump. Trump has simply taken off the mask, he's lifted the veil, and made it undeniable. But we've even heard for years now that people in Europe had been complaining about the vassalization of their region. In 2023, the major European think tank, the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is funded by multiple European governments. This is a very mainstream neoconservative think tank in Europe, pro-NATO, pro-West, anti-Russia. And yet even this think tank published a policy paper in 2023 titled "The Art of Vassalization," complaining how even under Joe Biden, before Trump won the 2024 election, that Europe's sovereignty was being eroded and that the US was treating its so-called allies as vassals and exploiting them. The increasing subordination of Europe to the US empire is a trend that goes back decades. But as with so many things, like de-dollarization and the growth of BRICS and the increasingly multipolar world, Trump has accelerated these trends that were already happening before him, but now they are seriously picking up speed as Trump is just blatantly threatening countries all around the world. Now, most of the world is moving away from the United States. This is especially true for BRICS countries. BRICS has been growing in influence and expanding. It now has 10 countries and 10 partners, and every year more countries join BRICS. This Global South-led organization now represents over half of the world population, 56%, and BRICS represents 44% of global GDP measured at purchasing power parity. So it's coming close to representing half of the world economy. So it's not an exaggeration to say that BRICS represents the global majority, and the global majority is moving away from the US and toward a more independent, multipolar foreign policy, whereas Europe is becoming more and more dependent on the US and more subordinated to the US. The most embarrassing and humiliating example of this was the NATO summit held in the Netherlands in June 2025, in which Trump held a press conference with the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, who previously served as Prime Minister of the Netherlands for 14 years, from 2010 to 2024, and he's from a right-wing pro-US party. And in this press conference, the leader of NATO, the former leader of the Netherlands, referred to Donald Trump as daddy. Listen to this humiliating clip.
They've had a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. You know, they fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes. Then it's easy to stop them.
And then daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
You have to use strong language. Every once in a while, you have to use a certain word.
Now, Trump was later asked about this by a journalist at a press conference, and he essentially made fun of his NATO so-called allies and said, "Yeah, I'm their daddy." And in the background of the clip, you can see U.S. Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio just laughing. This is so humiliating for the European vassals of the U.S. empire.
Mark Rutte, the NATO chief, who is your friend, he called you daddy earlier. Do you regard your NATO allies as kind of children.
No, he likes me. I think he likes me. If he doesn't, I'll let you know. I'll come back and I'll hit him hard, okay? No.
But do you
He did it very affectionate. Daddy, you're my daddy.
And that was just the beginning of the humiliation, because that same week in June, the US was waging war against Iran. And the head of NATO, Mark Rutte, sent a long text message to Trump, fawning over him, just buttering him up with praise. And Trump posted a screenshot of that text message on his website, Truth Social. And it shows the head of NATO bowing down to the US emperor and saying, quote, "Congratulations and thank you for your decisive action in Iran. That was truly extraordinary and something no one else dared to do. It makes us all safer." And then he continued talking about the NATO summit, quote, "You are flying into another big success in The Hague. Donald, you have driven us to a really, really important moment for America and Europe and the world. You will achieve something no American president in decades could get done. Europe is going to pay in a big way, as they should, and it will be your win," end quote. That was the head of NATO and the former leader of the Netherlands. This is the unimaginably low level to which Europe has fallen. And comparing European leaders' response to Donald Trump's first term and his second term, you can see just how bad things have gotten in Europe. As recently as 2018, during Donald Trump's first term as US president, European leaders were calling for strategic autonomy, saying that they wanted to balance their relations between the US and China and other countries. And Germany's former longtime Chancellor Angela Merkel, along with France's multimillionaire banker president Emmanuel Macron, Merkel and Macron together called for the creation of a European standing army, so they were no longer so dependent on the US and NATO. But that never happened. It was a bunch of empty rhetoric that was never actually backed up by tangible, concrete action. And also, if you go back to 2018, Donald Trump was pressuring European countries in NATO to increase their military spending from 2% of GDP to 4% of GDP. That was what Trump was demanding in 2018. Reuters noted at the time that European allies shrugged off Trump's demand as part of his brash push for them to increase military spending. And European officials in NATO said that actually we should increase our military spending to 2%, which they were supposed to spend, but at that time they were not actually meeting that target, before they continued to increase it even further. That's what they were saying just 7 years ago in 2018. But here we are in 2025, and not only have European vassals of the US agreed to expand their military spending to 2% of GDP, or 4%, they've now agreed to Trump's demand to increase it to 5% of GDP. At the June 2025 NATO summit in The Hague, NATO officially announced that Trump's demand had been turned into NATO policy, and that all NATO countries have to more than double their military spending to reach 5% of GDP by 2035. And what this also means is that US corporations in the military-industrial complex will benefit from a bonanza as European countries spend hundreds of billions of dollars buying US military equipment, because Europe simply does not have the capabilities of creating all of this military equipment, these weapons and ammunition and missiles and such. US corporations largely do. And we should keep in mind that in the statement that NATO released announcing the 5% target as its new official policy, it used a very important term, which is interoperability. What does interoperability mean? It means that all of the militaries of the different countries in NATO have to be able to work together in joint operations, which not only includes training. So, of course, you have European militaries and the US military do joint exercises together so their troops know how to work together. But not just that. It also means that there needs to be interoperable equipment and weapons and radars and communication technology. And that means that all of these European militaries are going to buy hundreds of billions of dollars of US military equipment to make sure that it's all interoperable within NATO as they prepare for war on Russia and China.
They're going to be purchasing hundreds of billions of dollars worth of military equipment.
So in short, it's not just US corporations that are benefiting from these tariffs that the US is unilaterally putting on Europe with the consent of the EU. It's not just US car corporations that are benefiting and pharmaceutical corporations, but also the US military industrial complex that is benefiting from hundreds of billions of dollars of deals that will be made with European members of NATO, these vassals that have agreed to pay tribute to the US empire. That's what they're doing. They're paying imperial tribute. And meanwhile, the people of Europe are going to be suffering because they're the ones who are actually paying tribute to the US. It's their money that is going to US corporations and the US military industrial complex. And the neoliberal right-wing and centrist officials who run Europe are already demanding austerity. They want to significantly cut social spending to pay for this arms bonanza that benefits the US military industrial complex. In the Financial Times, which is the newspaper of the British capitalist class and the financial elites in the City of London, the FT published an article by one of its columnists calling for Europe to trim its welfare state to build a warfare state. So Europeans are going to lose their robust welfare state, which has already been cut back over decades of neoliberalism, in order to benefit the US empire and prepare for war. The average EU member state spends 4.7% of GDP on education. So that's already lower than the new 5% target of military spending, but they're going to further cut education spending from 4.7% down to who knows how much, 3%, 2%, well, more than doubling military spending. And the average European Union member state spends 10.4% of GDP on healthcare, and there are many European countries that only spend around 5% of GDP on healthcare, like Luxembourg, Romania, Ireland spends 6%, Poland spends 6%, and yet now they're going to be cutting spending on healthcare in order to more than double their military spending. Now, it's not new for the US government to carry out policies that exploit Europe and benefit the US at the expense of its so-called allies. But what is different about the Trump administration is that Trump so frequently says the quiet part loud. And unlike Democrats, who often say that US policy is supposedly motivated by democracy and human rights, Trump administration officials say openly, no, we are an empire, we are a hegemon, we don't act benevolently, we act in order to support our own economic interests, to exploit other countries in a zero-sum game. In the Make America Great Again MAGA view of the world, one side has to win, that is the United States, and the other side has to lose. And this applies to everyone, including longtime US allies. In February, US Vice President JD Vance traveled to Germany, and at the Munich Security Conference, he attacked European leaders and he blamed them for many problems that were actually caused by the United States. What the Trump administration is illustrating is how correct the former US Secretary of State and war criminal Henry Kissinger was when he famously said, quote, "It may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal," end quote. Europe is learning this the hard way. There are so many examples of this, and of course, the unequal treaty that the US imposed on Europe is a very good one, but it's not the only one. So today in this analysis, I want to examine the other ways in which the US empire has been exploiting its so-called allies in Europe. The perfect symbol of this was in June when Donald Trump had a meeting in the White House with the leader of Germany, Chancellor Friedrich Merz. And there, sitting right in front of the leader of Germany, Trump boasted of sabotaging the Nord Stream pipeline. This was a pipeline project that was launched by the German government to connect Russia to Germany, because it was Germany that wanted cheap energy from Russia in order to power German industry. This is often referred to as a Russian project, but in reality, Nord Stream was a joint project between, yes, Russia, but also companies in Germany, France, and the Netherlands. This was a European civilian energy project. And yet, listen to this clip here in which Trump is sitting in front of Germany's chancellor and he boasts of, quote, ending and stopping the Nord Stream pipelines. Now, keep in mind here that what Trump didn't mention is that in 2022, those pipelines were blown up. They were sabotaged. At that time, Joe Biden was president. But listen to Trump take credit here for ending the pipelines.
On Russia, are you willing to put more pressure on Putin to end the war by imposing new sanctions on Russia and also on China?
Well, remember, I'm the one that ended Nord Stream 2. Going to a place called Germany, come to think of it. I'm sorry I did that. But I ended Nord Stream 2. Nobody else did.
This is how the US government treats its so-called allies in Europe. It boasts of sabotaging civilian energy projects in Europe because, as Trump admitted after in this meeting in the White House, the US wants Europe to be dependent on US energy, on importing liquefied natural gas and oil from the United States, not importing pipeline gas and oil from Russia.
That's essentially the largest pipeline in the world, going to Germany and other countries. And by the way, we have so much oil and gas, you will not be able to buy it all. I mean, you literally, we have so much, and I hope we're going to make that a part of our trade deal because we have more than anybody else. We have actually the most by far in the world, probably double what anyone else has. So we'll work on that. I'm sure that's something we'll discuss today.
So while the US government tells Europe to be so afraid of Russia, the US government is the one actually exploiting Europe. And this is true also under Democrats. But the difference is that Joe Biden claimed, I'm your best friend. I'm going to do everything I can to support you, Europe. Whereas Trump is no longer even hiding it. He's spitting in Europe's face and telling them they should be grateful. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this Nord Stream case because I think it's the perfect illustration of the extremely unequal relations between the US and Europe. So what exactly was Nord Stream? This was a series of 4 pipelines in 2 different groups that went through the Baltic Sea, connecting Russia to Germany, circumventing Eastern Europe. There were 2 series of 2 pipelines. Nord Stream 1 was completed in 2011, and Nord Stream 2 finished construction in 2021, but it was never actually used. And then in September 2022, the pipelines were blown up. They were sabotaged. And officially, no government has taken credit for blowing up the pipelines. However, the renowned American journalist Seymour Hersh, who won the Pulitzer Prize, the top prize in US journalism, he published an article citing sources in the US government who said that the US military blew up Nord Stream. Now, officially, the US government has denied this, and the CIA used newspapers like the Washington Post to pin the blame on Ukraine. However, even according to the CIA narrative, and by the way, we should be very skeptical of the CIA, given how often it has lied throughout history, including about the Iraq War. Remember, weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. But despite the long history of CIA lying, even if you accept the CIA's narrative, they admit that the US government knew that Ukraine was preparing this plan to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline. So even according to their own narrative, the US government played a role in green lighting this operation because Ukraine would not carry out an operation like this if it did not have at least the implicit support of the US government. At the United Nations Security Council, Russia introduced a resolution that called for an independent international investigation into the sabotage of Nord Stream. However, the Western countries opposed this. Only 3 countries at the UN Security Council supported the call for an international independent investigation. Those countries were Brazil, China, and Russia. The West was opposed. The government of Denmark briefly conducted an investigation, but then they closed the investigation and they did not blame anyone. The government of Sweden did the exact same thing. They briefly launched an investigation and then quietly closed it without blaming anyone. Now, mere hours after the pipelines were blown up, the prominent Polish politician Radek Sikorski tweeted a photo of the sabotage, and he said, quote, "Thank you, USA," end quote. Sikorski was previously both the defense minister and the foreign minister of Poland, and he's closely linked to the US government. He's a close ally of the US, and his wife is the neoconservative US columnist Anne Applebaum, who is closely linked to the US State Department. So the fact that he was publicly celebrating and thanking the United States was very symbolic. But today in 2025, it seems like so many people have forgotten about this incident that only happened 3 years ago. And now Donald Trump is in the White House and boasting of how he ended the pipeline while he sits in the front of the leader of Germany. And it's not even a big news story. I didn't see any major media outlets cover these comments made by Trump. Because really it's so normalized, this idea that the US treats its so-called allies in Europe like vassals. Because again, this project Nord Stream was launched by Germany. It was actually originally not a Russian idea. It was an idea that was pushed by German industrialists during the previous government of the longtime Chancellor Angela Merkel. Because Germany has historically been a major industrial power, although US policies are leading to rapid deindustrialization of the German economy, along with the US pushing for Europe to have an extremely antagonistic line against China, the largest trading partner of Europe. So all of these US policies are exploiting Europe, benefiting US corporations at the expense of Europe, and they're sabotaging Europe's relationship with its most important trading partner, China, and what was previously its most important energy partner, Russia. And that was why Angela Merkel wanted cheap energy from Russia in order to power industry in Germany. But Donald Trump himself admitted in this meeting with Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz that he instead wants Germany and the rest of Europe to buy oil and gas from the United States, not from Russia.
And by the way, we have so much oil and gas, you will not be able to buy it all. I mean, you literally, we have so much, and I hope we're going to make that a part of our trade deal because we have more than anybody else.
Later in that White House meeting, Trump recalled a conversation he had with the previous German Chancellor, Merkel, in which he complained that the US military was supposedly protecting Germany. You know, the US has thousands of troops and many military bases in Germany. And Trump complained and he said, "You are paying billions of dollars for oil and gas from Russia. Instead, you should be buying that oil and gas from US companies."
But I'm the one that stopped the pipeline. It's called Nord Stream 2. Until I came along, nobody ever heard, not one person in this room ever heard of Nord Stream 2. You probably did, yes, because it went to Germany. He's the only one that heard.
This was a mistake.
But I stopped him. I stopped it. Yeah, and you've said that openly. Yeah. It was a mistake because, and I used to go with Angela. I'd say, well, wait a minute. We're spending all this money to defend you against Russia, and then you're giving Russia billions of dollars a month. What kind of a deal is that? You know, which was, but you said it better than anybody else. I appreciate it. But I'm the one that stopped it. And that was the biggest economic development job, if you want to call it that, in the history, think of it, in the history of Russia. That was a massive, it's the biggest pipeline in the world. Going to go all over Europe, not only to Germany. You know, they're Germany, but then they were branching off all over to Europe. Nobody ever heard of it. Not one person of you heard of it. And I stopped it. It was dead.
Back in 2019, during his first term as US president, Trump imposed sanctions on any company that would work with the Russian gas giant Gazprom in order to complete the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipelines. Again, the Nord Stream 1 pipelines were finished in 2011. The Nord Stream 2 pipelines were not finished until 2021, and they were never used because of the threats by the US government. During Trump's first term, He was blatantly meddling in the internal affairs of Germany and essentially telling Germany that it could not continue to deepen its economic relations with Russia. And in 2018, as he was threatening Germany over the Nord Stream 2 construction, Trump referred to Germany as a captive of Russia, complaining that Germany was buying too much oil and gas from Russia. Because in reality, what Trump wanted is Germany and the rest of Europe to be a captive of the United States. He wanted to replace dependency on Russia with dependency on the US. And this is exactly what happened later. Of course, the Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed in 2022. That was after Trump left office. Trump left office in January of 2021, and Joe Biden entered. But in February of 2022, Biden warned Russia, and he said, if you invade Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 will no longer exist. He said that the US had ways to stop it, which was obviously a hint that Nord Stream would be destroyed, which it was in September, just a few months later. Listen to this very revealing clip from Biden.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
So again, this says so much about how the US sees its relations with Europe, and not just under Trump and the Republicans, but also under Biden and the Democrats. They do not treat their so-called allies in Europe as leaders of sovereign independent countries. They treat them as vassals. And we have video clips of 2 US presidents boasting of how they ended and stopped a pipeline project that was built by multiple European companies in not only Russia, but also Germany, France, and the Netherlands. And it was sabotaged, and the US government didn't care. It did not allow them to have their own independent commercial relations because the US empire does not see Europe as its friendly partner, but as its subservient proxies. And the results of the sabotage of Nord Stream have been completely predictable. The US has become the largest exporter of oil and liquefied natural gas to Europe. US fossil fuel corporations have profited. As of the beginning of 2024, the United States provided nearly half, over 47% of the liquefied natural gas, LNG, imported by the European Union. The US also was the source of 17% of the petroleum oil imported by the EU. Using official EU data from Eurostat, I created charts that illustrate the massive shift in Europe's energy supply in the past few years. Throughout the 2010s, Russia was by far the largest exporter of oil to the EU. Russia exported over 10 times more oil to the EU than the United States did. But the situation changed completely in 2022 with the proxy war in Ukraine, which was not simply a war between Russia and Ukraine. It was a war between Russia on one side and NATO on the other. And of course, NATO is led by the United States. In response to that war, the EU boycotted Russian energy. And what was the result? The United States became the largest exporter of both oil and liquefied natural gas to Europe. Previously, in the 2010s, Norway and Saudi Arabia were tied as the second largest exporter of oil to the EU. But a decade later, the US has overtaken Russia and Norway and Saudi Arabia as the #1 exporter. Something very similar happened with the EU's imports of natural gas. In the 2010s, the US basically did not export any natural gas to the EU, almost none. But as of 2023, the US is the second largest exporter of natural gas to the EU after Norway, which is actually in Europe. And Russia has gone from being by far the largest exporter of natural gas to the EU to now exporting comparatively little. However, the difference is even starker when you look at liquefied natural gas, LNG. Here, the US is by leaps and bounds the number one exporter to the EU. And this is because the US can't send gas on a pipeline across the Atlantic Ocean. That would just be too far. That's what Norway does because, again, Norway is in Europe and it sends natural gas through a pipeline. But instead, companies from the US liquefy natural gas. They put it on ships, they send it across the Atlantic, and Europe imports it. And it's more expensive. So Europe is now importing much more expensive LNG from the US. US corporations are profiting, and it's even worse for the environment. It's making climate change even worse. And while we're on the subject of the environment, I should point out that the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines was an ecocidal event, completely catastrophic for the environment. The United Nations reported that the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines resulted in the planet's largest ever human-caused release of methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is even worse than carbon dioxide in terms of exacerbating climate change. So this was a complete catastrophe for the planet. Now, speaking of Western hypocrisy vis-a-vis climate change, the German government had to reopen coal-fired power plants because it had a shortage of energy due to, one, its boycotting of cheap Russian energy, and two, because Germany shut down its nuclear plants. When it comes to climate change, coal is by far the worst source of energy. It emits more carbon dioxide than all other sources of energy. And on the other side, you know what emits the fewest emissions? Nuclear. Nuclear is the cleanest, greenest form of energy there is. And yet, ironically, it was the so-called Green Party of Germany that advocated for closing down all of the green nuclear power plants, and now Germany is reopening extremely anti-green coal plants. And also, the so-called Green Party of Germany is extremely pro-war, extremely militarist, extremely pro-NATO, anti-Russia, pro-Ukraine. All of these policies are anti-green. They've made climate change much worse and done significant damage to the environment. In addition, of course, to the millions of lives that have been lost due to these militaristic policies. This just shows how much of a joke the so-called Green Party of Germany is. However, I should point out that not all Green parties in the world are like this. In the US, for instance, the US Green Party is very progressive, very anti-war, and the US Green Party recognizes that the US military is the single largest consumer of oil on Earth and one of the largest greenhouse gas emitters on Earth. So you cannot support the US military and NATO in war and also actually care about the environment and opposing climate change. It's a completely contradictory policy. Okay, now with all of that said, I've made it very clear how the US empire exploits its so-called allies in Europe and has subordinated them to US political and economic interests, turning them essentially into vassals. But what is the strategy? What is the end goal here? Well, it was spelled out very clearly by the late US imperial strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is extremely influential in US foreign policy circles, and he served as the US government's national security advisor under President Jimmy Carter. In 1997, Brzezinski published the book The Grand Chessboard: American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives. He wrote this a few years after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, and in this book, he boasted that the US was the only superpower in the world and that the US had a global empire that controlled pretty much every major region of the world. And he talked about strategies that the US empire could use to prevent the rise of another superpower that could challenge the unipolar dominance of the United States. This was the unipolar moment. And in this book, Brzezinski warned about potential scenarios that could lead to challengers to US global dominance. He wrote, quote, the United States may have to determine how to cope with regional coalitions that seek to push America out of Eurasia, thereby threatening America's status as a global power, end quote. And Brzezinski's imperialist view of the world was influenced by the British imperial strategist Mackinder, one of the fathers of geopolitics, who was theorizing ways for the British Empire to exercise control over the world. And Mackinder famously argued that Eurasia was the center of the world island and that empires needed to control Eurasia in order to control the world. And this was something that US imperial strategists borrowed from British imperial strategists after World War II. Now, in this book, Brzezinski warned of the possibility of, quote, a European-Russian accommodation to exclude America from the continent, end quote. And he outlined what he saw as a dangerous scenario, which was, quote, the possibility of a grand European realignment involving either a German-Russian collusion or a Franco-Russian entente, end quote. So he was really concerned about the possibility of Germany and Russia forming an alliance or France and Russia forming an alliance. This is something that the US empire has long been very afraid of, especially considering that Germany has an advanced manufacturing sector and Russia has huge supplies of cheap energy, so their partnership makes perfect economic sense. And in fact, this was one of the main reasons for the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, during the First Cold War against the Soviet Union. Washington was afraid that the new government in Germany could potentially have good relations or even an alliance with the Soviet Union. Of course, East Germany was an ally of the Soviet Union. So if you go to the NATO website, they openly admit this. They quote the first ever Secretary General of NATO, Lord Ismay, who famously said that NATO was created, quote, to keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down, end quote. And today this remains the goal of NATO, to keep Russia out, the Germans down, and the US on top, allowing the US empire to subordinate the previous European empires to the US empire. And this strategy has obviously been doing significant damage to the economy of Europe. You now even have mainstream Western media outlets warning of the growing deindustrialization of Germany, which is the economic motor of Europe. And the reason for the deindustrialization of Germany and the economic problems is in large part due to the new Cold War against China and also Russia. The boycotting of cheap Russian energy, which was needed to power German industry and to make it competitive, but also the very antagonistic position that the West has taken against China, how the US has pressured Europe to attack China. So where is Germany going to export its cars? The German car industry has relied for decades on the massive Chinese market of 1.4 billion people. And yet now, more and more, the German government has been criticizing China, taking a hard line against China under pressure by the United States. And therefore, the German political class is doing damage to its own economy, antagonizing its largest trading partner at the behest of Washington. So this raises a fundamental question. Why is the European political class so dedicated to Atlanticism, to this cross-Atlantic, transatlantic alliance between the US and Europe, especially at a moment like now when the Trump administration is openly attacking Europe and spitting in the face of European leaders? And yet, what is their response? They're literally crying. The chairman of the Munich Security Conference broke out in tears in public in response to JD Vance's speech attacking him. I mean, this is the pitiful situation of the leadership in Europe, which is literally crying like children because they refuse to grow a spine and stand up to the US empire. And honestly, I think a big reason for this is economic. These European elites have sold out their own countries, their own populations, their own working class for their own economic interest. Rich Europeans have invested trillions and trillions of dollars of wealth into US assets, especially in the US stock market. As of 2024, Europeans owned around 15% of the total market capitalization of US equities, of the US stock market. And European investors have plowed into US assets, especially in the past decade, and in particular in the past few years, especially big tech stocks from the Magnificent Seven, these corporations like Meta and Apple and Amazon. European capitalist elites have invested much, much more than the elites of any other region of the world. In Asia, some of the elites have definitely invested in the US stock market, but Europe has taken it to a whole new level, investing trillions and trillions of dollars. And European capitalists hold huge parts of their wealth, their portfolio, in US assets. They are extremely overweight US assets. So it's in their economic interest to continue to subordinate their countries and their economies to the US because it serves their bottom line. They don't want to be more independent of the US because they're all in. If foreign investors start to sell their US assets, their stocks and US bonds and real estate, it could lead to a significant fall, even a collapse in the price of US stocks, of US real estate, of US bonds, which would hurt the portfolios of all of these elites in Europe. Of course, there are also cultural reasons and historical reasons. Many elites in Europe, many politicians studied at elite universities in the United States, and they are close friends with people, with elites in the United States. But honestly, I think a lot of this has to do with their economic interests. As European economies became financialized in recent decades with the rise of neoliberalism and free market economics, this meant that many European elites became economically subordinated to the US economy, especially to the US financial sector and Wall Street, and also to the US big tech companies, because Europe does not have big tech corporations. Europe economically is entirely beholden to Silicon Valley, to Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, which are very popular in Europe, to Google, which owns YouTube. Google has huge influence over Europe's economy. Not to mention Amazon, which also is expanding across Europe, and not only Amazon in terms of selling things, but also Amazon Web Service, AWS, which oversees a lot of the cloud in Europe. So economically, Europe has become more and more subordinated to the US, and European capitalists have become entirely invested in the United States. They are the Comprador bourgeoisie, not the national bourgeoisie. They are not trying to advance the interests of their own nation. They are entirely economically wedded to the United States, and they see the interests of the US as their interests. And today there are a few European leaders like Emmanuel Macron in France who at least try to be a little more independent. He uses this rhetoric of supposedly being more independent, although at the end of the day, Macron in France almost always fall in line with the US empire. But even despite the political will that exists, which is very small, this process of becoming more independent of the US is going to take years, if not decades, because so many European elites, like Macron, who's a former investment banker and a millionaire, they're going to have to diversify their portfolio significantly, which they don't want to do because that would probably make them much poorer. And at the end of the day, these oligarchs care more about their personal wealth than the well-being of their countries, especially if you look at who these Western political leaders are. They're all oligarchs and plutocrats. France's President Macron was a banker. Italy's previous Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, was also a banker. Germany's current Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, was the chair of the German arm of BlackRock, the world's largest investment company based in New York City. And now Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, ran not only the Central Bank of Canada, but also the Central Bank of England, of another country. And before that, Mark Carney worked for Goldman Sachs, the US investment bank. And of course, the US president, Donald Trump, is a billionaire oligarch. All of these Western leaders are oligarchs, and they're entirely invested in Wall Street. And unless there is a significant radical shift in the political leadership in all of these countries, not just in Europe, but also in Canada and the US, it's going to be very difficult for them to move away from Wall Street because it's in their economic interest to continue to subordinate themselves to US finance capital. Now, finally, before I conclude here, I want to make one other important point. And this goes back to the book, The Grand Chessboard, that I cited earlier, that was written by the influential US imperial strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski. I mentioned that in this book, Brzezinski outlined potential scenarios that could challenge the global unipolar dominance of the US empire. And he was concerned about the possibility of a Russian-European alliance, especially between Russia and Germany. However, he wrote that, quote, the most dangerous scenario would be a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran, an anti-hegemonic coalition united not by ideology, but by complementary grievances, end quote. And this is basically what we see in the world today. A close partnership between China and Russia and also Iran. Iran is now a full member of BRICS. And every single year, BRICS is expanding more and more as dozens of countries across the global south want to join because they're seeking alternatives to US-led Western domination. And this is why the Trump administration is so desperate in trying to divide China and Russia. Trump has said openly in public that he wants to try to divide Russia and China because he sees this alliance as a major threat to the US empire. But I think in this historical moment, Europe is at a major crossroads. The US empire is waging a new Cold War on China and trying to pressure leaders in Europe to go along with the US. And this comes after Europe is already waging economic war and in a proxy military war against Russia, which was previously its largest energy partner. And it's obvious that if Europe continues to go along with what Washington wants, it's only going to lead to further economic problems in Europe, and especially the deindustrialization of the European economy, the further financialization of Europe, and the further subordination of European economies to the US, to Wall Street, and especially to big tech corporations in Silicon Valley, because Europe has no alternatives. So Europe desperately needs a change in its political class. It desperately needs leaders who will stand up to these oligarchs, to these big corporations, to Wall Street, to Washington, and will forge a new independent path and implement progressive policies that actually benefit the working class and average people, not just these oligarchs in the city of London. And we see now that the political leadership is doing the exact opposite of that. They're continuing to strengthen the oligarchy. So there's a very real possibility that Europe could be left behind in this increasingly multipolar world if Europe does not forge an independent path. And I hope the election of Donald Trump is a wake-up call, especially when Trump has taken off the mask and in the White House, he's inviting European heads of state, like the German chancellor, and he's boasting in their face about how he sabotaged their civilian energy infrastructure in order to benefit US fossil fuel corporations. If that's not going to be a wake-up call, I don't know what will be. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.